Okay.
Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us today. For those who don't know me, my name is Lynn McKenzie, and I'm the immigration lead here at Relocation Africa. Our business has over 27 years of providing services across Africa, and our immigration division in particular supports various categories of temporary and permanent visas, such as study, visitor, and business visas, work visas, permanent residence, exit visas for the continent of Africa. However, after 27 years and building off the success of our existing immigration division, we are so proud to launch our outbound services. Whether you would like to work, retire, invest, or just start your new life, Relocation Africa would be happy to help you embrace the unknown. Our team and associated partners in the respective jurisdictions would provide seamless facilitation of your immigration needs. Now, I'm very excited about our topic today. We're going to be examining the immigration landscape in the USA. I'd like to welcome our partner, Noah, who works with Relocation Africa to fulfill these cases. He is an expert in US immigration and will be sharing with us some pertinent information pertaining to our topic we will be covering today. So thank you, Noah, for joining us. How are you doing?
My pleasure, Lynn. I'm doing wonderful. It's so great to be here speaking with you today.
Thank you so much. We've got a lot to cover, so we are going to dive right in. Can you give our audience a brief insight into the current immigration policies and procedures that are in place as a result of COVID-19?
Sure. Well, it's a big topic. There's a lot, that we could discuss. I was thinking to, try to just give at least a high level overview, of where we're at currently, with the COVID situation. We could also, delve into more detail if you like, but it's the kind of topic, we could go on for hours about it.
Exactly.
So I'll try to at least start with, just a high level, summary. So, one of the biggest things affecting us right now, and it has been affecting us since, COVID started back in March, is the closure of the U.S. consulates and embassies around the globe. Mm-hmm. So they were, pretty much completely closed except for emergency services, in the first, let's see, maybe 4 or 5 months, of COVID. And then in the summer, they supposedly started reopening, but it's been very slow going. Yeah. And so even right now, it is quite difficult to get appointments, for and with U.S. immigration, as you might be aware, unlike I think a lot of other countries, usually you have to go for an in-person interview at the U.S. consulate or embassy in order to get the visa. I think a lot of other countries, it's more of a mail-in, type thing, but the U.S. is interview, part of the process, and so that has made it difficult during COVID. Yeah. So if I could choose one thing that's really had the biggest impact, there have been a lot of other things that we can talk about them, but if I could choose one thing that's had the biggest impact, it's been, the U.S. consulates and embassies closing down / having quite limited, visa processing. Yeah. And we're still at that at the moment. I mean, it's possible to get appointments, but it depends on the consulate, depends on the visa type. Oftentimes you have to request an emergency appointment, it's still iffy, is what I'm getting at. So there's a lot of other things, but, I don't know how much time you want to spend on each point.
No, absolutely. But just in hindsight, I mean, that would mean that at least immigration authorities are operating, right? So. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Lynn. I'm sorry.
No. So basically, the immigration are operating. What is the current situation on processing? So you've touched the topic on the in-person appointments. Is there anything else with regards to processing right now that you can share with us?
Yeah, sure. So I think it probably would help to talk a little bit about, how the U.S. immigration system works in terms of work visas and the process.
Yeah.
So, generally speaking, to get a U.S. work visa is actually a 3-stage process. The first stage is filing what's called a petition with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS, in the United States. that is a paper-based filing, that's sent off to USCIS office, here in the United States, and it's usually a pretty thick submission,
Hmm.
with legal arguments, a lot of supporting documentation and everything. So for like an L1 work visa, H1B work visa, most O1 for extraordinary ability, most U.S. work visas, that's the first stage. And with that, in terms of talking about COVID, that has not really been affected,
Okay.
fortunately.
Yeah.
That's still been pretty much, operating, mainly because it doesn't require, an in-person interview or contact. In addition, a lot of the USCIS officers actually were working remotely even before COVID. And so
Oh,
that, has helped.
right.
Yeah, so with this first stage, the petition process has not been much of an effect on COVID. So that's the first stage. You file the petition, get that approved. And then the second stage is what we were talking about before, the in-person interview, at the US consulate or embassy. Um, then the third stage is once you have the visa, then applying for admission into the United States.
I see.
Most people don't think of this as an actual stage in the process or an application of any sort. Just think, well, I have the visa, fly to the US, show up
Yeah.
there, and I'll get in. And usually it's like that. But technically speaking, that is the third step in the process, and it is an adjudication where you meet with, if you've ever been to the US, I mean, most countries are like this, where there's an
Yeah.
officer, you have to speak to them, and the US is called US Customs and Border Protection, CBP, and you show them a visa, and then, and this is, a key part of the process, even though, like I said, a lot of people might not think of this as a part of it, is then the officer will actually admit you into the United States and give you your third US immigration document called an I-94
Yeah.
admission record.
Okay.
And a
Very,
lot of people actually get thrown off about this because
yeah.
they think, okay, I have the visa. And so even once I get into the US, that's the expiry date, and the document that I need to keep track of, but it's not. It's actually the I-94. So,
Yeah.
there's these three stages to the process. And yeah, stage one, not really been affected by COVID so much. Stage two, like we discussed, has been very heavily affected by it.
Yes.
Uh, and then stage three as well, has been affected to some degree, so a significant degree in
Yes.
terms of, whether people can fly into the US, even if they have a valid visa.
Exactly. And that is such a good point, though, Noah, because that third step, most people think, like you said, I have my visa, all's good in the world, let me
Yeah,
in. But they
yeah,
don't realize, which I've heard cases where people will be would be, at the border and trying to be lawfully admitted, and then something happens and they can be turned away. So
right.
there's not always guaranteed. I mean, that is a topic in itself, but I've
Yeah.
heard those types of stories. So that's such good information for people to understand that there's really not two, but there's three steps to that. You know
Yeah.
what I was curious about, though? You were talking now about these three steps and the impact of COVID on step two in particular. Has your local government made any directives or concessions, for those who really do need to be in the United States, for example, for work purposes, business purposes, or for any other purpose really? Have they made any waivers maybe or some other concessions?
Yes, there have been some concessions. We spoke about how the biggest impact is the, closures or the limited processing at the U.S. consulates or embassies, but there have been other, impacts, such as these bans, that President Trump, enacted through executive action, through presidential proclamations, for anybody who has been physically present in the UK, Ireland, Schengen area, China, Iran, or Brazil within the immediately previous 14 days. And then there was a second big presidential proclamation banning the entry of any H-1B, L-1, H-2B, or certain J-1 exchange visitors. It sounds like, well, what does that have to do with COVID? So what the stated reason for that, we call it, H-1B, L-1 ban, was COVID, in that, there's, been a rise in unemployment in the US and kind of protecting the labor market.
Yes.
So what I'm getting at is that with these presidential proclamations, there is a waiver process. Because, well, before I get to that, I should also mention there's exceptions, you
Yeah.
know. So like, for example, relatives of US citizens, an exception. There's a number of exceptions. Usually our clients don't fall into one of those just clear-cut exceptions, and it has to be under national interest, and then there's a waiver process for that, with the country-based ban from UK on the Schengen area. And then with the L1H1B ban, the big one lately has been if the employer, the sponsoring employer is a member of certain organizations. The big one is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And that came about through litigation, through the U.S. government getting sued over the H-1B L1 ban. And that litigation is still ongoing, but the judge issued a preliminary injunction, stating that for the plaintiffs, which included the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, National Association of Manufacturers is another big one, NAM, that for the plaintiffs, that there's this preliminary injunction, against the H-1B L1 ban. And so if an employer is a member, of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce or NAM, and they can also just join now.
Oh, okay.
And like the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, for example, it's pretty easy to join. Cost is quite minimal. I think it can be even for as little as, a couple $100. So for those bans, there are some, ways around it. But again, going back to where we started about how the biggest impact has been the limited processing at the U.S. consulates and embassies.
Yes.
That's often the biggest struggle, has been, since COVID started and continues to be, to get an appointment at the consulate, even if it's an emergency one. And, like I said,
sure,
it is possible. It just takes some work.
It takes some time. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's very insightful. But yeah, I think also in terms of now we've just kind of set the scene on what the current situation is and how people need to be able to work through these processes and how they can, administer and use your expertise to be able to do so. But a lot of our viewers are just have no clue about the immigration landscape at all in the US. So we can even start at sort of immigration 101. So what are the authorities that are actually enforcing immigration laws in the United States? Who's responsible for that?
Sure. And so, we touched before on how there's different stages, to the U.S. work visa process. And with each of those stages, there's a different agency involved, And it's a great question and a great thing to talk about, because if clients understand, these different agencies and how they operate and how they handle each part of the process, it helps, to kind of understand the overall process. Especially if they've dealt with other countries, because where it's all unified, which would make sense, but the U.S., it's a lot of things in the U.S. immigration system are counterintuitive, and just don't make much sense, including this one. So
law in itself.
yeah, exactly. So going back to these different stages we spoke about. So stage one, the petition, that's handled by U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, or USCIS for short. Excuse me. Then stage two, the visa application. Oh, and I should say that USCIS is an agency that falls within the Department of Homeland Security. So like in the U.S. government, you have departments, and then within the departments, many agencies.
Gotcha.
So, and the Department of Homeland Security is probably worth mentioning. I mean, the job of the Department of Homeland Security, and it's a relatively new department. It was created by George W. Bush, President George W. Bush, after 9/11, the 9/11 terrorist attacks.
Yeah.
Where he basically took, as part of his plan in combating terror, thought, well, we should take all of the agencies, that deal with Homeland Security and combating terrorism, that type of thing, and put them all together under a department so that they can work more, in a more unified fashion. And so he created the Department of Homeland Security, and one of the immigration agencies that he put under there created was USCIS, which was formerly known as Immigration and Naturalization Service, INS.
Ah, yes.
Yeah. So that's the first one, USCIS. They handle the petitions. Then in terms of part two, the visa processing at the U.S. consulate or embassy, that's a totally different, not just agency, but department.
Okay.
And it's the Department of State. And I think that, there are other countries that have a similar bifurcation. Like I think with Australia, for example, I don't know if it's like this anymore, but it used to be, I think that, they had the Department of Foreign Affairs, they handled their, I think there are countries like that.
Yeah.
Because, with it's a department that's handling the country's, excuse me, offices abroad, consulates abroad. So the Department of State, which, the main function is diplomacy. And it's a very different, department, to deal with than the Department of Homeland Security. And so we try to explain that to clients in terms of approaching the visa interview.
Yes.
And then, so that's the, the second part, the agency that's involved in the process. And then the last one in part three, we were talking about the entry into the United States, is U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP for short, that also falls under the Department of Homeland Security. And as is probably common in other countries, with CBP, the way we usually describe them is, they're like police officers.
Yeah.
And just to prepare clients, for what that interaction is like.
Yes.
And where the CBP officer is coming from, and that type of thing. Those are the main agencies. There's also the U.S. Department of Labor that gets involved with certain applications, mainly the H-1B work visa and the PERM labor certification, which is required for most employer-sponsored green cards.
That's right.
Yeah. They get involved mainly in saying what the minimum rate is, the market rate that has to be paid to the H-1B workers and for the green card, the PERM green card.
Yeah. And with all of these different departments or immigration authorities, how much discretion do they have in granting or refusing applications?
That's a great question. So they have a lot, to be honest with you. And the main reason why is that in U.S. immigration, there are a lot of kind of vague requirements and terms as part of the requirements. So like, for example, with an H-1B, one of the main requirements is that the role the job that's being offered has to be a quote unquote specialty occupation.
Okay.
And it's this vague term that, basically boils down to being a professional role that normally requires at least a bachelor's degree in a specific field. But there's just, what I'm getting at is the vagueness gives the officer a lot of wiggle room. So they could say, well, yeah, we see that it usually requires a bachelor's degree, but we think that it's not really a specialty occupation because it could be done by somebody that has a number of different bachelor's degrees,
right?
Not just, or something like that.
Right.
It just gives them a lot of wiggle room. Another example, maybe even a better example, is with L1 work visas for intercompany transferees. There are even vaguer requirements. So the role has to be either executive, managerial, or specialized knowledge, or require specialized knowledge. And these are they're very vague terms.
Yes.
And the regulations do, discuss the terms and define them, and, also policy materials and that type of thing. But it's just, at the end of the day, there's a lot of wiggle room,
Yeah.
in terms of, well, is it really executive in nature, or, or is it not? Is it managerial or not? Especially with the specialized knowledge,
Yeah.
for L1B, intercompany transferee, visas. It's so vague, and there's just so much wiggle room, and it's just so easy for officers to say, well,
Well, no.
I don't think it's really, yeah, they require some knowledge, but we see that there's other people in the company that have that knowledge, so it's not unique enough, and that type of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So speaking of all these specialty kind of work visas, are there any industries that are more favored in the US than others, or is kind of everybody treated equally?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say that any industry is favored more than others, but it does seem sometimes that there's some, nationalities that are treated differently, and also certain types of companies.
Yes.
Like, so for example, companies that, like staffing companies that, are sponsoring H1B workers, or, or L1 workers for that matter, sponsoring foreign nationals, and then having them work at a client site. They, really are subjected to a lot of scrutiny.
Yes.
So I would say that it's difficult for them. And then also with the nationalities, it does unfortunately seem that, with certain nationalities, that sometimes they get more scrutiny,
Yes.
in adjudication as well.
I
Yeah.
can understand that. Yeah. So we talked briefly about the work visa. So what about short term? So visitors visa, or are there any short term work visas that are available in the US?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So there's, the standard visitor visa is the B class, and there's B1 for a business visitor, B2 for a tourist visitor.
Okay.
Excuse me. And there are around 38 countries that are members of what's called the Visa Waiver Program,
Okay.
where they can come as a visitor for up to 90 days without having to get a B visa, at the consulate, which, like we discussed before, is a bit of a process, requires an in-person interview, at the consulate and so forth. South Africa, unfortunately, is not a member of the Visa Waiver Program.
Very unfortunate.
So, yeah, maybe someday, hopefully someday, but at least as of now, it's not. And so South African citizens would require, a B visa.
Yes.
And oftentimes they're issued as a combination, B1/B2, so they can be used for either purpose. And then, you're asking, what can be done, can any short-term work be done, with a B visa?
Yeah.
And the answer is yes. It's a complicated area, and it's important to tread carefully with this.
Yes.
But there are certain, types of work that can be done, on a B1, business visitor visa.
Okay.
So for example, if there's the after sales service category for B1. So let's say, you have a South African company, let's say they create, they manufacture, I don't know, air conditioners, let's say. Okay? But let's say it's big. They say it's big, massive, cooling equipment, for ventilation equipment for for businesses. And they sign a big contract with a U.S. company for these ventilation units, And as part of the contract, as part of the agreement, is that this South African manufacturer will send over, some, specialized workers to help install the ventilation equipment.
Yes.
at the U.S. business. In that scenario, the B1 visa can be used.
Can be utilized. Okay.
Yeah, for a short term, maximum, 3 months normally, maybe 6 months, at the extreme.
Okay.
But and there's other examples as well, but that's the most common one that
The
comes
most
in
common.
after sales service.
Oh, that's so interesting. And that would also include the B1, B2. That would also include people, say, who are obviously attending maybe business meetings or need to receive or give training or attend conferences and all that good fun stuff, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So attending conferences and attending meetings is the most straightforward use of the B1 business visitor visa. There's no question that's totally fine. And normally a B1 visa holder will actually get admitted for a 6-month period.
Oh, okay.
Which gives a lot of flexibility, Now it's a little bit confusing in that I would not, we not normally, well, let me put it this way. If, let's say, an applicant goes for their visa interview at the, U.S. consulate in South Africa and says that they need to be in the U.S. for 6 months, they probably won't get the visa because the consular officer will say, yeah, because the consular officer will say, 6 months for meetings. I mean, that's crazy.
Yeah.
But the standard admission period is 6 months. So they will be admitted for 6 months.
So interesting. Yeah, it's so true because intent is everything. They want to know you don't have intent to stay too long.
Exactly.
So we talked about work permits and everything like that, and which is so helpful. But in our last little few minutes, let's just touch on businesses. So, businesses right now are in their planning time. They want to know what they can do with regards to moving their people and if they need to move to the US, for example, for work purposes. What would you recommend to them in planning? Any tips from a business perspective? I mean, obviously they need to be a little bit more flexible. Things are changing as the time on the clock is changing. So what would you recommend to some of these business folks?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is that, if they have an established business in the U.S., established U.S. operations, then chances are that, they're employing some foreign nationals and that some of those foreign nationals that they're employing are recent graduates that are working in what's called OPT status, which is just basically work authorization that students, get, foreign national students get after they finish university in the U.S. Normally for a year, but if it's in a STEM field, it can be for up to 3 years. So I would recommend that companies, look at their records, their foreign national employees, and see if they have anybody, who's a grad working in OPT status or STEM OPT status. And if so, to look at whether they want to file for H-1B visas for these students. Okay. Because, the OPT is going to run out eventually.
Yes.
And so, normally you want to be trying for the H-1B so that you can, if the company wants to continue, employing those graduates. Right. And that process, the filing is in March and it's a 2-step thing. I don't know how much you want to get into detail about the H-1B process, but the first part of it's in March. And so it's actually good to start planning for that now, even, a couple months in advance. That's the first thing that comes to mind.
And there's a cap on that, right? Noah, there's a cap on the amount of H-1Bs that are allowed every year?
Yes, 65,000 plus an additional 20,000 set aside for foreign nationals that have a U.S. master's degree.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so basically the way it works is, and this was just a new process that just started last year, is in March, companies file a fairly straightforward online form as a registration for the employee that they want to sponsor on the H-1B.
Okay.
And then USCIS completes a random lottery to select the 85,000, 65,000 plus 20,000 masters.
Yeah, that's
And, and then by the end of March, they've done at least the initial lottery, and then companies will find out if their employees have been selected in the lottery, and if so, then they have 90 days to file the actual petition, H-1B petition.
Yes.
Yeah. Now, it's worth mentioning that there's a proposed regulation, by the Trump administration to, instead of doing a random lottery, instead choose the 65,000 or 85,000 highest paid.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is pretty wild. It's going to be fought in the courts.
Yeah, I'm sure it will be.
And also there's the question of, what was that, sir?
With a new transition too, it'll be fought in the courts, I'm sure.
Right, right. And or, the new administration may, just try to pull that back, but it's worth at least mentioning that that was proposed and actually put into the rulemaking, formal rulemaking process.
Absolutely. No, that's really good to know. Yeah, no, that's great. No, thank you so much. I can't tell you, that we could honestly talk forever, I feel. We could delve into so many of these topics, but I think it was just so nice to give just a glimpse to our viewers about US immigration. And of course, if they have more questions, they can come to us. So thank you so much again, Noah, for today. And I know that our viewers are going to find this information just so valuable. So, reminder to everyone who's listening, if you'd like assistance with US immigration or any other matters, you are most welcome to contact us via immigration@relocationafrica.com or by our website via www.relocationafrica.com. Noah, you're a star. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody else. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks, Lynn.